Yeah, thanks, Rob, and thanks everyone for joining us in what I hope will be a really interesting conversation. Thanks to Helen and Joanes. Good to see you guys. Thanks for making the effort to be here. I'm going to let Rob do the majority of the chairing of this because he's put by far the most effort into the framing of this. But yeah, just wanted to say a few words at the beginning of welcome. And yeah, hopefully this will be an interesting discussion going forward. Rob, do you want to take that forward?
Okay, thanks, and yeah, thanks everyone for choosing our session. So I'm going to chair. I'm Rob Byrne, senior lecturer in SPRU, and together with Dave, we've been convening the energy and climate change work of the STEP Centre since, I don't know, 2007 or 8 or something like that, a long time. And I suppose in terms of this, the topic of this session in terms of reframing climate technology policy, we started on the basis that we found certainly the dominant approach in the climate change negotiations to be about financing clean energy technologies, and that to our minds this was a very narrow framing, and so we set about trying to argue a case for broadening that frame. So if you like, the starting point for our session is to think, well, to what extent have we and others, not just us, but others, actually been successful in changing that frame? So that's sort of one of the questions we will try to address. But then, of course, coming from sort of critical social science perspective, and as we have done, as I'm sure many others here have done, try to engage with policymakers and sort of power, if I can express it that way, to bring, social science, that critical social science to policy making, to policy advice and so on, has its own challenges, regardless of the sector. But it would be good to discuss some of those issues as well, and then to think about the future, about what specifically in when it comes to climate technology policy, what is kind of missing now, and that counts in terms of the academic literature as much as it does in the policy documents. So they're the kind of three sort of main issues that we're hoping to discuss. We've got a panel to help us get started, and the panel is Helene Ahlborg and Joanes Atela, both of whom have been long-standing friends and collaborators with us in the STEP Centre, and of course have been doing their own work. Helene is an associate professor at the Department of Technology Management and Economics, Chalmers University in Gothenburg, and her research is focused on rural electrification in East Africa and societal transformation. And that includes studying the co-development of technology in society and how providing electricity services based on small-scale renewable energy sources impacts people's lives and communities, and how local context and social, economic and power relations between different groups, poor and rich, women and men, young and old, village and town, and more, influence that process. And she builds on and contributes to debates in energy and development, to innovation studies, science and technology studies, socio-natures, and to feminist and power theories, and has worked empirically, or continues to work empirically, in Tanzania and Rwanda. Currently, she is coordinating a CEDA-funded partnership with the University of Rwanda on sustainable energy, which I believe includes clean cooking. So welcome, Helene. And Joanes Atela is a senior research fellow at the African Centre for Technology Studies, ACTS, where he heads the Climate Resilient Economies Programme. He's also an associate lecturer at the University of Nairobi's Institute for Climate Change and Adaptation. And he coordinates the Africa Sustainability Hub, which was the kind of African arm, as it were, of the global sustainability consortium that was mentioned in the introductions. He also founded and convenes the Africa Research and Impact Network, ARIN, which brings together researchers and policymakers across Africa to learn and share good transformative research and impact practices. And he's the lead of the African Union Green Innovation Framework, where he has led the development of an innovation framework to inform African countries' pursuits of green growth. So welcome, Joanes. So what I propose to do is, first of all, to ask Helene and Joanes to provide us with some answers to 3 questions, which I've just put into hopefully into the chat. Hopefully you can all see. And to answer one or all of those questions, whichever they feel most comfortable with, just to kind of get things started. So a few minutes each to provide some initial thoughts, and then to open to general discussion. And I would really encourage it to be a discussion and not a question and answer session. So it's not about questioning the panelists. It's about sort of building on their initial thoughts and providing comments and thoughts yourselves. When we come to that, I would ask you to remember to just briefly introduce who you are, say who you are, if you're invited to speak. Otherwise, you can, of course, contribute via the chat. I'll try to keep an eye on it, and Dave hopefully will be able to keep an eye on it for a while before, I think, having to leave 2:15 maybe. And we'll see how it goes, and then we'll sort of wrap things up, hopefully in time to join the plenary session. So can I first turn to Joanes? Joanes, perhaps if you can just give us your initial thoughts, just for just a few minutes, just to get us started.
Yeah, so thank you. Very briefly and in a summary way, into the question. In fact, the first question was quite interesting. In what ways have the efforts to reframe climate technology policy been successful? We have basically done a lot of work with, of course, Dave and Rob on issues to do with bringing the socio-technical thinking in some of the debates that are going on, especially within the energy space. And I think that in one way or the other, of course, linked to the other ecosystem of activities that are going on within, of course, Kenya, but also in Africa, I would say has contributed to some success in basically thinking technology. And this success, I would say, is mainly seen in the policy space. And part of this is because there has been some, strategic, focus in the way we've been doing this work to ensure that the process of co-creation and bringing together different stakeholders, policymakers, in our socio-technical approach to the research that we've done on energy, solar home systems, of course, including elements to do with innovation systems, basically including everybody in the process and working closely with policymakers. And a couple of times, Rob has had to come down to Kenya, and we have these discussions, capacity building with policymakers on a very direct perspective. So that, in a way, has led to the social elements of technology to be considered. And as I've said, this is mainly at the policy level. We see, for instance, in Kenya, there's a lot of focus on issues to do with climate justice, social justice, especially in some of the technologies that are developing, green technologies. But also at the global level, we just came from Glasgow, where we saw there's a lot of focus and passion around climate, justice, and trying to bring in the social perspective into the decisions and the vulnerable people, the different voices into the technology and action framings within these particular global spheres. And that in a way has really borrowed a lot from the evidence that has been generated. We are actively participating in the COP. So the evidence that has been generated, not just within the projects that we've been doing, but the broader pathways approach, which has basically planted a seed of thinking more broadly and trying to bring different perspectives to the solutions that we are seeking. And just also to mention, I have been leading the AU Green Innovation Framework, and I've had this discussion with the African Union. And one of the things that has come out, the framework report has just been released now. And it's very central that in this report, the role of social innovation and bringing in the social voices in the way green technologies and green growth is being framed is very central to this particular strategy. So that is at a policy strategy level. However, I would warn that policy and action are two different things when it comes to Africa. So while there is some success at the policy level, having informed those strategic policy discourses, the practicality of this on the ground in practice is still a big question. And this is because a lot of the actions when it comes to energy, when it comes to green technologies, when it comes to are driven by the private sector. When it comes, in practice. And the private sector, in terms of how they pursue things, how they frame things, is not necessarily framed in line with the policies. Yeah, a lot of times it's framed in line with their own understanding of the market, the opportunities, the business models, which are all good. So at the end of the day, there is that gap in terms of whether this pursuit or this success in terms of profiling the voices of the social voices in the technology space, whether this get to the ground. And this is something that I think needs much more work moving forward. And I think, linking that to the second question, I think is more of a question of consensus building. There is need for more dialogues and discussions and trying to bring different actors together, especially the private sector in this debate. I think for a long time, this debate has been pursued by academics and policies, and there's that link, mainly academics trying to produce evidence and saying this evidence could support policy, certain policy framings, but a number of times the disconnect, there's no efforts to really understand, the private sector perspectives and how they can be brought in. So I think that is very critical. And finally, I think looking at this, if you have to bring the private sector into this discussion, we need to understand the social metrics of technologies, because then we really need to try and sort of profile and clearly articulate what are these, social perspectives, what are these benefits, how can we quantify some of these social benefits, or qualify, quantify might not be the right way, but qualify some of these social benefits in a way that then can be used as a negotiation sort of space to bring these different actors, especially the private sector and other actors who are very instrumental in implementing some of these things on the ground. Back to you. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Joanes. Yeah, some interesting additional points there, and I'm just looking at some of the names of the people here, and some of those are very directly kind of political economy issues. So perhaps we should hear something about that when we open up the discussion. But Helene, can I pass over to you and you give us your thoughts?
Yeah, thank you, Rob and Dave, for inviting me. It's always a pleasure. So, when I think about this question about efforts to reframe climate technology policy, I don't think so much about my own work, because I've only recently started to engage very directly with policymakers, and that's in the sort of a new program under the International Energy Agency umbrella, where we are trying to sort of engender energy use policies in Sweden and multiple other countries. So there we are trying to do something progressive, using sort of mobilizing the concept of gender in order to speak about power. much more broadly. So there we're trying, you know, it's great that the energy agencies want to care and think about and introduce and integrate gender into their policies for energy users. So that's wonderful. But then we are like pushing that and trying to then think about inclusion much more broadly, because it's not just gender, it's quite intersectional. So that's sort of where we are trying to pick up on the momentum that's we can see happening. But I also felt I need to look around what is happening more broadly. And I looked at this UNFCCC work around climate technology policy. And they have this technology executive committee that was established in 2010. And they're still active. And I just took a look, like, how has their focus shifted over those years? And what I can see is that they started with, I mean, we had this separation of mitigation and adaptation technologies. So there we have still a silo where they place like water and agriculture as sectors on adaptation, and energy, it's all mitigation, right? So already there we are working with still a very problematic way of organizing ourselves around this, like Deepak was saying, that's because of the institutions are still thinking in those boxes. As we're using these concepts of mitigation, adaptation, you know, putting them on top of existing boxes, and that's what we're trying to deal with then. But what I could still see in their focus, a shift towards South-South collaborations much more strongly in the last years. They were also going from very few technologies and kind of broadening out. And there's a quite interesting document from last year where they are showing a high degree of uncertainty about what actually constitutes a climate technology. And I think that's really interesting, where they are struggling to place agroecology into this because it doesn't fit any of the boxes that they have predefined. And they very clearly state that and say that this then needs us to rethink our approaches and processes. And as I find that to be really good and fruitful, that we are kind of opening up to also rethink what is a relevant technology, what is a technology, what does it mean in this context? So that's some of the examples I see in terms of positive developments. What I do think, however, and this relates to our work, so I have a project with my PhD student, Sam Answorth, about innovation, how we understand innovation in the energy sector and how it travels across the world. And there we can really see that, you know, what is considered to be innovation, who is considered to be an innovator, and where we think innovation happens. It's the largely Western Silicon Valley model that gets just, you know, pushed onto the rest of the world, or just, you know, happily adopted, but not with enough of critical thinking about what other views and how we can understand innovation in different ways. And so there's this really interesting book by Mawunga and colleagues about what does innovation mean from Africa. And we're trying to be inspired by their approach and really think through how we can open up to other ways of understanding innovation and the role it should play here. And that is for us like a really important exercise. So what we try to do then from a critical social science position here when we work with these institutions in the policy sphere is that I'm thinking I'm there to complicate things and disturb the boxes. I think I have to be very pragmatic, and like Joanes was saying, we need to communicate and have a dialogue, and I need to be constructive and not just critical. So I have to get out of my critical mindset to the constructive while still being really insisting on the messiness and the fact that we can't take these boxes for valid. And that leads me to the last question about perspectives that are still not adequately understood or addressed, both in literature, research, and policy. And I think, you know, in the energy transitions field, I see one really, really important thing that has to do with boxes and the silos but also the fact that we're still having a techno-economic way of thinking about this, is the entire sort of treatment of the entire material side of extraction and mining that will come with expanding infrastructures and the production of all these wastes coming with these new infrastructures. That is being seen as externalities because they're not within what is normally treated within an energy policy. It says nothing about the end of life, nothing about the extraction side. And here I've looked at especially the Rwandan energy policy that is really progressive in many ways, but is still not including either, you know, the entire life cycle. And that's is also a problem in Swedish energy policy. And this has to do with these global value chains. So it's about power again. And I can see this also reflected in the literature on energy justice, where this is rarely highlighted. It doesn't show up in the free tenet framework, but it does show up in the embodied energy justice work. There's a great article on that. And I do think it's not just us like introducing life cycle thinking, because that's still based on the same boxes. So, you know, I also work with systems thinking, and it's great. I agree, you need to get, you know, from the linear mentality and silo thinking to at least socio-technical systems. But then we need to not just slip into accepting and taking those systems for granted and being happy with, yes, we got them to think about socio-technical and not just techno-economic. But actually then we need to queer our own ontologies again. So we're not just, again, reproducing these silos, new boxes, but still very, very clearly divided boxes. So I guess that's where I'm trying to think about, you know, for the work of and be inspired by plural ontologies, and also how, for example, Mara Goldman has a nice piece on drought and how it's understood very differently by the Maasai communities and the scientists and NGOs working in the East African sphere. And I think her work on the drought and trying to really show how it's not innocent, it's not just epistemology and knowledge making, it's actually world making, and it's enacted in practice. It has real consequences. So it matters the fact that we should not take our own boxes for granted. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you, Helene. Lots to think about there. But just in a kind of simple message, we've got a lot of boxes to deal with. And actually, in the spirit of steps, I guess this idea of opening up and broadening out is a continuous process. There isn't a kind of an end point that we don't sort of open up and now we've got everything. Actually, it's recursive. We open and we examine, and we open and examine, and so on and so on. I'm sure you must have noticed the message from Nathan that we are to finish at 14:25. So that gives us less than 15 minutes. My watch is correct. So I will invite sort of comments, thoughts, etc. from the floor. Just to remind you that this is being recorded, so you might want to bear that in mind when you're speaking. But I see that Lucy, you put in a comment to agree very much on the life cycle and value chain of energy technologies. I don't know if you wanted to expand on that.
Yeah, hi everybody. My name's Lucy Baker and I'm in the Science Policy Research Unit. And it was really just an endorsement of what Helen said. In fact, when I saw the different working groups for this whole session come up, one of them was on minerals extraction in Latin America, and I was actually really tempted to go to that because presumably they're talking about lithium, and which plays an active role in batteries that then in turn plays an active role in solar PV technologies. And I do think that in terms of both the extraction of the raw materials that go into climate technologies, however you're defining those climate technologies, but particularly solar PV and wind, and then also the afterlives of these technologies. So there's some really good work by Jamie Cross and other people. He's an anthropologist at the University of Edinburgh. And if you're looking at the life cycle or the production network or the value chain, I think there is work on this area that's emerging, but I think that it's something we could be much more systematic about. So it was really just to endorse what Helen said.
Thanks. Just to remind you, maybe raise your hand if you want to make a contribution, or you can put it in the chat. But just to go back then on this extraction thing, I mean, this is certainly a big issue in some parts of Africa, and I just wonder, Joanes, maybe you can come back and tell us the extent to which the kind of extraction has been included in thinking about innovation and green growth, for example, in that strategy, or to what extent you've heard concerns about extraction in the policymaking world.
Yeah, well, that's an interesting question, and I would love to also hear from the participants. But when you talk about extraction, I think it's a wider political economy question, driven by really, some I would say relatively higher level forces that perhaps are not properly seen, but also are kind of circumvented or protected or safeguarded by the powerful policy maker space. While this remains a major concern in broader, political economy knowledge. I mean, we talk about not just extraction, we talk about large-scale land grabs and stuff like this. So these have been actually highlighted quite a lot in a number of knowledge perspectives. The extent to which they have become a policy concern remains relatively unclear and basically relatively weak. And this is because of what I said, that space is really operating at a relatively higher level. While there are global movements that try to push for some of the rethinking and consideration to really tackle some of the challenges around extraction, I think these movements really remain operational at really very high levels and are not sort of grounded. That is not to say there are no concerns or extractions taking place or processes that promote extraction at the ground level. These also exist, but I think they are also sort of incentivized by this broader space. And so I would just say it's a wider political economy question that might require that the discussions and dialogue at that high level.
Okay, thanks, Joanes. We have two, I think, linked comments in the chat. So perhaps can I invite Chris to sort of elaborate on what you've put into the chat here on the importance of allocation of resources to deal with storage and handling of materials, and then I'll call on Burgess.
All right, thank you. So just a comment, and I appreciate the opportunity, and with the policy creation within the government and with regards to moving forward, depending on how that can be addressed in a proper issuance of policy, action must reflect the allocation of resources to be able to demand, because as time and progression over a long period of time may not result in the same, may create a greater barrier to that reflection upon the mining and extraction and creation of clean technology. So depending on how it's dealt with is where I was coming from. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And Burgess, good to see you in some time.
Yeah, good to see you. I'm a past SPRU grad for those who I haven't met. Yeah, so I guess sort of just an interesting anecdote is here in Canada, we have, as I'm sure many of you know, some of the world's largest oil and gas reserves, but very highly problematic ones in terms of environmental cost, carbon cost, et cetera. Now, it's a very problematic transition as well because of the amount it contributes to our GDP. And our government is starting to be cognizant of that. And they're looking to the future a little bit here and there. in particular because of the large mineral reserves we have. So things like Canada is currently developing significant cobalt reserves to try and contribute to the battery needs of the world. And of course, this is driving some challenges with our politics of the United States. But I think the biggest problem is that as we're continuing some of our social challenges as well, where the lands that are where we get our best mineral reserves are some of the best preserved sort of environmentally left in Canada, and they're also lands held by Indigenous people. And we're having a very much a reckoning of our colonial past here in Canada with how we treat Indigenous people, what right our government has to come in and start developing these mineral reserves. And questions of, yes, globally for climate reasons, we need those mineral reserves, but where do we stand on a moral and ethical status of how do we treat Indigenous people, their lands and their rights compared to sort of the needs for these minerals? And I don't think anybody has really any good answers at the moment on this. It's sort of it's a massive national crisis, honestly. And I'd actually love to hear from others if you have researched this or experienced this or have any thoughts or comments, because I mean, I spent the last few years working for our federal government, Natural Resources Canada, and it was absolute chaos, the blind leading the blind, so to speak. So, I think it's an area that's worthy of consideration, and it's a huge, huge challenge. So.
Okay, thank you, Burgess, for raising that. On the issue of extraction, maybe no surprise that, and thinking about Africa, that my immediate thoughts turn to South Africa, which is, an economy that relies very heavily on certainly on coal. And so I have in mind perhaps to ask Britta if she maybe has something to add here, but also thinking about other countries and political economy, certainly in the more general sense, would be to ask Wei to chip in as well with some thoughts on kind of what's been happening in China. So perhaps, Britta, I see you put in a post on the chat. Perhaps you could come in and speak about it instead.
Oh, thank you, everyone. My camera seems to be working very well. I'm a research fellow on ideas.
I don't know if Wei, if you're trying to speak, but it's very muffled. I can't hear what you're saying.
Can you hear me now?
That's better. Yeah.
Sorry, I'm using an older machine. Just the recent event, just try to endorse Lucy and Helene on this. It's like, some unnoticed minerals, because their relation to the renewable energy or actually clean energy sectors can be suddenly become precious and popular. Cobalt is enterprise, and then everybody is focusing on that because it is a very useful material that can prolong the endurability of the batteries. And previously nobody noticed that. And then suddenly it becomes a strategic asset or resource. And then there's a lot of geopolitical dispute about Chinese dominance on this resource. So I think it's related to global value chains, it's related to, the changing values of also the geopolitical implications behind that. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Wei. And Britta, perhaps, just in case we get cut off and sent back to the plenary in a few minutes, perhaps, Britta, if you could sort of chip in and say something related to your post in the chat, which sounds really good, actually.
Yeah, hi. Thank you very much, Rob, and greetings to everyone. Yeah, so what I found using a lot of the work that's come from, the global north in analyzing climate technology, but also socio-technical transitions and so forth, it's been helpful, but it also we struggle because the conversations here are so different in a way. So you continue to have the similar framings, but you often need to adjust and mix and match. And what we find now, there's still a very stunning gap basically between the different actors that you find both in the extractive industries and in the climate policy networks. And I think what is important thinking of Africa is that it needs to be part of a more global conversation, sorry, just one second. So as I put in the chat, so the continent only contributes to about 3 to 4% of global emissions. So, and they're deep development challenges. So there needs to be some leverage in a way to meet these, and climate technologies are very important to get to the development pathways that are desirable. On the other hand, we're very close here to net zero already in many parts of the continent, and so it's difficult to speak of the continent given that it's so diverse. Now, what we've seen recently in South Africa is actually some good signs, I think, in terms of the way that the narratives have been come together under the framing of a just transition. So if we think back to the first NDCs now for the Paris Agreement, there were maybe 20 people who knew what an NDC was. Now prepping to the update, we've had calls with like 300 and more people in it. There's a presidential climate commission talk about just transitions. And it's led also to the more conservative parts in the government to talk just transitions and to be more proactive in that area. But still, the conversations are very detached, the actors are detached, and there's a lot of that global and kind of like aid-related push towards, kind of like that aid and climate agenda have sort of like been blended in a very unfortunate way that gives others the opportunity to push back in this post-colonial, decolonial narrative, which is very unhealthy. So I don't know if you saw that deal that the South African government struck on the just transition. So there's a big financial agreement towards decarbonization, which is very good news. But then the first push against it by the Ministry of Energy was the right for Africans to develop fossil fuels. So, that kind of narratives can get very dangerous. So yeah, just I see we're closing, but I think that is, they're the fossil fuels in the ground, the world will exploit them. The question is like who will benefit and how to bring these conversations together. Thank you.
Thank you, Britta. Yeah, so we got 40 seconds before we're back in the plenary session. So I won't attempt to summarize here. Sorry, Helene, I'm not going to let you speak because there's no time. But thank you, Helene and Joanes, for your contributions, and for those from the rest of you participated here. It's been interesting, even if we have only just opened up a few things rather than begun to even get close to resolving anything. And hope to see all of you along the way in other forums in the future. And enjoy the rest of the conference.